Did Dallas Federal Reserve Bank President and CEO Robert Kaplan actually publicly admit on Friday, October 11th, why Repo Madness has been ramping up and why not QE4 is needed so soon? So I want to give credit to Lynn Alden. She is an emerging macro blogger and analyst over on Seeking Alpha, and I saw this tweet that she put out a few days ago, and I started looking into this more, and it appears that the new Dallas Federal Reserve Bank President and CEO, Robert S. Kaplan, and he is the predecessor to Richard Fisher. Richard Fisher, I think, was one of the more honest Fed chairmen. He actually had a real-world background. He worked in business. He was a successful businessman. He worked on Wall Street. He was not an egghead. He was not a PhD economist. I believe he didn't have a PhD. I think he had a couple degrees, but not a PhD. So he actually had practical real-world experience. Richard Fisher was one of the few people at the Fed. I think he was the only person who actually voted no against one of the QE programs. He voted for QE1, I think, and I think he voted either against QE2 or QE3. He said all the extra QE programs were unnecessary. So this guy, Robert Kaplan, he said in an interview that the big change in need for reserves for the banks is dramatic. Not only did the Fed take reserves down with quantitative tightening and reduce the money supply. David Jansen, my buddy, has been covering this. Jensen. You can follow him on Twitter for free. David, David Jensen, Jensen. But also that the reserves is a dramatic increase in treasury issuance. So the president and CEO of the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank, he is now blaming the amount of borrowing from the U.S. Treasury. So he's blaming Congress. He is blaming, most likely, given this guy's political background, and I will talk about it, most likely he is blaming President Trump and the Trump administration. There are a lot of people at the Federal Reserve who hate President Trump and the Trump administration. So this guy Kaplan, his biography reads like a globalist, okay? He went to Harvard, he studied there. I think he was even a Harvard professor. Let me just check this on his Wikipedia and also his Dallas Federal Reserve biography. So he worked as vice chairman. He worked his way up. He worked at Harvard for many years and before he joined the Dallas Fed. And he was also a vice chairman of Goldman Sachs. And nonprofits, you know, the normal globalist charity nonprofits. So this guy has been around in the champagne socialist, rich hardcore Democrat, limousine liberal circle. So this appears to me that he set things up now. If you read the tweet there, it's on your screen. Fed's Kaplan, the big change in need for reserves is dramatic increase in treasury issuance that takes liquidity out of the system. Banks are also holding more reserves because of capital requirements, and that's why Repo Madness has had to occur in basically the last month. Or at least that's when we found out about it. The first time we found out about it was late Tuesday night, September 16th. And then the article started rolling out like crazy the next day on September 17th. So it's not a full month yet for Repo Madness. And then so soon, the not QE4 occurred way ahead of schedule. Because normally the procedure, people are not aware of these procedures. Normally these things happen at a Fed meeting. And the fact that this was announced before a Fed meeting is very curious. Normally, this stuff it's voted on, it's discussed at length in Fed meetings. They choose whether or not it's edited in the Fed minutes, what we see. The Fed minutes are very highly edited. They claim they're not, but I believe Danielle DiMartino Booth in her book, Fed Up, she disclosed that those Fed minutes are heavily edited. And I think I read it somewhere else confirming that as well. So I think that this guy, Robert Kaplan, my educated guess is he is trying to blame shift, play the blame game, and he's trying to move the blame because they're well aware, everyone at the Federal Reserve, unless they're total brainwashed, total idiots, and it's not likely, they know a lot of the data. The global macro data is getting worse. There's tons of leading economic indicators for the global macro data. That's just getting worse and worse. And eventually, that's going to make the corporations reporting the earnings and the revenues, that's going to make that data worse. And we're already seeing signs of this. But there's more and more leading economic indicators for the global economy that are getting worse, whether that's air freight. The new one is air freight goods are back to 2008 levels. That's another bad one. So that's added to the list. Goldman Sachs was talking about how on 3,000 conference calls, I think for Q3 2019, on 3,000 conference calls already, that the CEOs are warning people that the numbers are going to be just bad going forward for the next couple quarters. That the numbers were bad for Q3 and the forward guidance for future quarters to come is going to be worse. So I think the Fed is preparing. They realize that over the next 1 or 2 years, that things are going to get a lot worse in the global economy, and the Fed is attempting to blame shift, attempting to play the blame game and focus the problems with the U.S. government with the borrowing, with the increase in treasuries. Because the U.S. has, I believe, issued in less than the last month around $250 billion in treasuries. Now, remember, I covered this, that the U.S. Treasury in July, they put out a projection for the rest of their borrowing needs from July 2019 through the end of 2019. And they were projecting $814 billion that they needed to borrow. So officially, the U.S. government is running around $1 trillion budget deficits. Unofficially, the numbers are way, way worse. Jeff Gundlach's estimates were around $1.4 trillion in public debt added last year in 2018. And I've seen estimates that are a lot higher than that, off-balance sheet items and unofficial items. But the official deficits are just massive. So my opinion and why, normally the Fed presidents are not this candid. They're not going to speak out like this, and Lynn pointed this out, quoting that news information there on the tweet. So this is a surprise amount of candor, of honesty from a Fed president, admitting that the Repo Madness and the not QE4 is, in his opinion, and he probably has a lot of information on this, occurring because of how much borrowing the U.S. Treasury has, and that's reducing the amount of available capital for other people. That's crowding out others because the U.S. needs more dollars. The U.S. is, and there's a lot of emerging market dollar-denominated debt that has to get paid, so that's creating a lot of problems for everyone else because the U.S. government needs to keep borrowing too. And the U.S. government's funding needs take priority. And I think if you look at, I'll put links to Kaplan's background, his bio. So he's got like Goldman Sachs, Harvard University, a lot of nonprofit charities, globalist ones. He looks to me to be like one of those very rich, hardcore Democrats. And this is blame shifting. This is playing the blame game. The Fed is saying that it's not the fault. The Fed is attempting to say that this is not the fault of monetary policy. This is the fault of the U.S. government running budget deficits. When in reality, it's everyone's fault. The Fed is the great enabler. There cannot be big government. There cannot be growing big government. There cannot be this much waste, fraud, corruption, and abuse. There cannot be an enormous military-industrial complex. There cannot be military bases everywhere and upgrades for all these weapons and endless amounts of wars. And if Mike Pence replaces President Trump, even more wars, probably with Iran and or Venezuela added to the list. There cannot be these things and massive welfare spending. There cannot be a welfare and warfare state without a central bank and fiat currency. Because if the people were directly taxed and had to feel this burden directly, they wouldn't stand for it. It's the fact that not 1 in a million people can detect inflation. That's why governments love central banks and fiat currency and changing the economic data and changing the definition of inflation and changing the and changing what's in the CPI calculations, all those things. So according, one other guy, excuse me, I'm just coming off a cold. One other guy who was analyzing this said that around, according to the not QE program, they're going to be covering about 70%. So the not QE program now will be eating up about 70% of all the U.S. government's budget deficits. I haven't run the numbers myself, but that's what this guy was saying. So it's very interesting that we have a Fed president speaking out like this and actually being candid about Repo Madness and not QE and why it's happening. Because there's been a lot of speculation why. What do I think about precious metals being taxed in almost all states now? The federal taxes on gold and silver are not good anyway. Their taxes are collectible. You don't get to lock in long-term capital gains. Look at the work of Daniel Amerman. He wrote these articles in the last 7 or 8 years. You can go to his website, DanielAmerman.com. He covers taxes on metal. Eating up what? Demand, eating up dollars. Eating up dollars. There's a lot of demand for dollars globally. An enormous demand for dollars. China's desperate for dollars. Emerging markets are desperate for dollars. There's already too much dollar-denominated debt globally. So when the U.S. government has to borrow more and more, it crowds out everyone else. Brent Johnson has been talking about this dollar milkshake theory and how, in spite of the U.S. government borrowing and others, why the dollar has not collapsed. The dollar index is actually, it's a little bit above 98. I would not be surprised if the dollar index is below 98 by the end of next week. Despite the correction in paper gold prices, I think the long-term winner on this is gold. Because all these governments, U.S. government, European Union, Japan, China, all doing very, very dumb things. Emerging markets, all doing very, very dumb things. So they can manipulate the gold price in the short term down all they want. The miners right now cannot raise much capital. So there's going to be mergers and acquisitions. The royalty and streaming companies with cash flow are just going to do more quality deals long term for more cash flow. And Trump, I think with his compromise, the compromise on phase 1, he's trying to keep the stock market going up. Peter Schiff doesn't understand China. China's attempting to trick and then trap dollars coming and euros coming into the Chinese economy, and then they won't let them leave. Honestly, I don't think Peter Schiff understands anything about China. China tried, before this phase 1 on the trade deal, China tried to trick foreign direct investment in, and they couldn't get any more money in. James says China's now more free than the US. No, it's not. No, it's not. My channel, from what I've heard, Wall Street for Main Street, now, obviously, YouTube is blocked with VPN. I didn't explain this right a couple weeks ago. But someone was chatting in WeChat with someone in mainland China about my channel name, Wall Street for Main Street, and they got they were in school, and they got a visit. They had to go to the principal's office a couple days later and got a lecture on bad Western influence and lies. So my channel name, because I've interviewed Emma Mollman and also Denny McMahon, and the China topics I talk about. So Wall Street for Main Street is watched. It's flagged. China's definitely not more free than the U.S. Not that the U.S. I mean, the stuff that goes on with the NSA and the big technology companies is really bad. But there is no free speech at all in China. There's at least some free speech here in the US. This is an excellent super chat question by Drago0. If the world is starving for US dollars to pay down US dollar debt, wouldn't that cause a dollar melt-up? Well, this is the problem with what this is the problem with the Treasury and the Fed. They don't want a strong dollar. So yes, the more demand for dollars would cause a higher dollar, and this is why we have had a dollar rally now for over a year. So they're trying to walk a thin line. The Treasury, the Trump administration does not want a strong dollar. The Federal Reserve does not want a strong dollar. The US Treasury does not want a strong dollar. They want a controlled devaluation. But the rest of the world has over-borrowed in dollar-denominated debt, so there is a strong demand for dollars in China and especially emerging markets. And also foreign corporations that have over-borrowed in dollar-denominated debt. So you have a situation where demand for dollars globally is strong, and the people who are supposed to, quote-unquote, manage the dollar, they don't want a strong dollar. So you have two countervailing forces. And that's why the dollar rally probably will not go much higher. They will come up with new ways to devalue it. A strong dollar is good for export. No, the strong dollar, the textbooks say that that a weak dollar is good for exports. That's mercantilism. A strong dollar is actually good for savers, and it's good for consumers. Because you have more purchasing power with your currency. So savers get a strong currency for more purchasing power and savings and consumption. So countries should want a strong currency, but everyone's operating out of the same mercantilist or neo-mercantilist playbook. I occasionally cover geopolitical topics. It didn't get many views. I interviewed lobbyist Jack Abramoff a couple years ago. It only got like 1,000 or 2,000 views. I thought it was a good interview. It didn't get the traction. Yeah, a weak dollar is bad for imports. I agree. But I said a strong dollar is good for savers and consumers. And importing is normally considered consumption. Oh, thank you, Greg, for the super chat. Yeah, so right now the U.S. Treasury is sucking up a lot of the demand for dollars. So it's exacerbating problems in emerging markets in China. Look, I respect Peter Schiff a lot. He woke me up when I was a regular investor advisor representative, a regular stockbroker, registered investment advisor. I respect him a lot. He's just wrong on China. I don't even know if he knows any of the details about China. About the China hustle, the documentary, the accounting problems. I don't know if he knows any of that stuff. Andy, I think the corporations all want a weak dollar. But they're all from all these guys who run the CFO departments. They've all loaded the balance sheet with debt, and they all want a weak currency. The reality is that the consumer and the saver in dollars benefits from a stronger currency. But in practice, the people who are managing the currency, the central planners, the central bankers, the people running the treasury departments, the politicians, the corporate CEOs, they want weak currency. Especially if they loaded the balance sheet with debt. If it's a country that loaded their balance sheet with debt with government borrowing, and if it's a corporation that overloaded the balance sheet with debt, they want a weaker currency. Anthony's right, savers are losers with inflation. Yep. And savers actually benefit from deflation, but deflation cannot be taxed. That's why governments hate deflation. Deflation cannot be taxed. And inflation is a tax, and there will be new taxes layered on and old taxes increased. And if you only talk about inflation, you're missing the picture, the full picture. The full picture is inflation, currency devaluation, and taxes. Max Kaiser thinks the gold standard is imminent. No, I totally disagree with him. They're going to do a bunch of other really dumb things over the next couple years before they even consider it. No, it's not the amount of gold you own, Anthony, for gold standard. It's a function of price. And will the people in power allow gold to go over $5,000 an ounce or over $10,000 an ounce without doing a lot of really dumb stuff, or putting in a windfall profits tax on anyone who owns gold, or attempting to nationalize or confiscate or put windfall profits taxes on gold miners? There's a bunch of really dumb things. There's plenty of gold. The problem is the price. After World War I, Winston Churchill refused to have a gold standard at a higher price. So this show, the comments are very unusual by a Dallas Federal Reserve Bank president and CEO to be making those comments, but I think he really hates Trump, and I think he wants to shift as much of the blame as possible onto the Trump administration and Congress. And then blame the Federal Reserve loves to do this, to say it was not the fault of monetary policy for why a crisis occurred, it was fiscal policy. The Federal Reserve loves to do this. And it looks like that this is going to be a strategy. An increasing strategy. The blame game is extremely popular here in the DC metro area. And from the background of the guy running the Dallas Fed, he definitely looks like a very hardcore Democrat, so his comments are going to be political. I never said Churchill was a good person. I just said that Churchill was in charge before he became the prime minister. He was in charge, chancellor of the exchequer. He was basically the British equivalent of treasury secretary, and he set the gold price too low after World War I. I never said Churchill was a good person. Oh, FDR was horrible, and so was Woodrow Wilson. Well, the Fed, it sounds like the Fed is monetizing debt now. The balance sheet is increasing. Jim Bianco, Bianco Research, who's not a gold bug, but is buying gold on every dip now, and he was interviewing to work at the Federal Reserve too, so they at least respected him enough to interview him for that. But he went back and looked up the comments for Ben Bernanke about what quantitative easing was before the QE1 program was launched and then when it was announced. And Ben Bernanke defined QE1, the quantitative easing program, as an increase in reserves and balance sheet expansion. So the Fed is attempting, they're obfuscating, confusing, and lying. The Fed is attempting to change the definition. And that's why this is, quote, not QE. QE. Welcome to dystopia, right? You know things are desperate when they try to change the definitions constantly. It's moving goalposts. It's rules changes. I've said this for many, many years. You can go back in the archives. Rule number 1 is they will change the rules. And they may do it all the time going forward. And if they're going to change the definition of words, or they're going to change the definition of this economic data, or they're going to change the definition of inflation, or they're going to change what the CPI formula is, that's how they keep most of the people unaware of what's really happening. Look, I just ate lunch, a late lunch today at a fast casual taco restaurant, and I haven't been there since May or June, and the size of my chicken tacos are down, the amount of chicken, the amount of meat in the tacos were down 50% since May. So the portion size with shrinkflation was decreased 50% since May. That was the last time I ate there, and they raised the prices $1. But there is no inflation. Yeah, Deutsche Bank could have collapsed. We don't know. There's no audits, and the rules are changing. Oh, thank you for the super chat, Mark. Hey, guys, my voice is starting to go. Someone was complaining about it on the live stream show yesterday. I have a cold, so I'm doing the best I can. I need to hustle and earn some money. And I didn't see anyone else in the gold community or alternative media talking about this. There was one other disrespectful person yesterday who said that they were a PhD economist and they were working at this economic consulting firm here in the Washington, D.C. metro area, and that they knew more than I do because they have a PhD in economics. Well, congratulations. Would you like a freaking cookie? You have a lot more student loan debt than me. You might have a six-figure job. I've interviewed for six-figure jobs as a financial historian at a hedge fund and private equity firm a number of years ago. But I have over 10,000 hours of studying. I've read over 500 books, thousands of articles. I've interviewed hundreds of people who are worth a lot of money, 7, 8, 9 figures, a lot of people. They're all in the archives over the years. Apparently that doesn't matter to her because she's making more money than me and she's part of the status quo and she has her stupid little degree. And she didn't even use her real name. Because if she said something nasty to me, then her employer, could potentially fire her. Well, Andy says rates can never go up without an economic collapse. Well, here's the thing. So the Fed attempted to raise rates, and the Fed took it with quantitative tightening. They reduced the balance sheet. They tried taking reserves out of the system. They tried reducing the interest payment on interest on excess reserves, and now they're having to backtrack a total 180. So all the attempt they did to raise rates and reduce the balance sheet, they only got the balance sheet down from 4.5 trillion to a little above 3.7 trillion. So that's only around 17% officially reduction in balance sheet. And then here we are, the balance sheet's already increased over $190 billion in not even 6 weeks. So the balance sheet bottomed out at the end of August, and we're already up over $190 billion in not even 6 weeks. Look, I'll take my 10,000 hours, 10,000 plus hours of study and all the reading I've done from a lot of different sources against any PhD economist. I've spoken with people off the record at the Fed. It's pretty funny how some of them think. Yeah, so the Federal Reserve is crowding out because their demand for borrowing is so much. And eventually you will think that this will hurt the emerging markets more, this will hurt China more. Although with this new trade deal, China may get the dollars it needs then. This financial White Wolf says he recalls the days when a rinky-dink passbook savings account at the local bank paid 5.75%. Yeah, those days are long gone. This financial repression, this Japanification, these overly indebted big governments that are too big and won't cut their budgets, and these large corporations are stealing the interest payments from Main Street and savers and people that need that to retire, and stealing it from pension funds. That's how the status quo is maintained, is all those interest payments are stolen, redistributed. No, I think Trump didn't listen to Lighthizer, based in China. I just think Trump chose not to listen to Lighthizer, not to listen to Kyle Bass. Kyle Bass said 2 weeks ago, he said, if President Trump listens to his advice, there will not be a trade deal anytime soon. That if President Trump listens to the advice of his top two trade advisors, Bob Lighthizer and Kyle Bass, there will not be a trade deal anytime soon. He was very blunt with that. This was in his American Thought Leaders interview for free on the American Thought Leaders YouTube channel. Okay, well, my voice is starting to go. So I want to thank Lynn Alden for making me aware of this. And then I took the information that I found there, and I added more to it, that I think this is the Fed doing blame shifting. So this is a hardcore Democrat, limousine liberal, shifting the blame onto the Trump administration because the Fed now realizes that the next 1 or 2 years are going to be very, very bad. And so they're trying to put the blame on Trump. There's a lot of people at the Federal, from what I've heard, there's a lot of Bernie bros now at the Federal Reserve, at the lower levels, lower and middle levels. There's a lot of Bernie bros at the Federal Reserve and Elizabeth Warren fans. And they're trying to shift the blame to Trump. Although I think the blame also goes to Congress, because Congress is so inept, so corrupt at this point. Congress could only agree on doing not even worrying about a debt ceiling for 2 years. Just ridiculous. So the Fed is in blame shifting, blame game, spin mode now. And the not QE program, we're going to have to keep doing more shows and checking the balance sheet, because I suspect things are going to get a lot worse. Okay, well, thank you everyone for listening, and thank you very much to my 160 now Patreon account contributors. Hopefully it's 200 in a couple months. Thank you to my dozen or so monthly PayPal contributors. And thank you to the people that tip me once in a while. It's much appreciated, so I can focus on just creating unique content and analysis that you probably won't get anywhere else. And also, as an added benefit to my Patreon account contributors, there's a 9-page in-depth article on Sandstorm Gold behind the paywall there. So if you're already a Patreon account contributor, you can log in and read the article. And hopefully you'll find the information, my opinion, information and analysis useful. If you're not a monthly Patreon account contributor, for $5 a month and want to read the article, it's $5 a month. You can read some really good analysis there on the company Sandstorm Gold that you definitely will not find on Seeking Alpha, because there's people on Seeking Alpha who write articles and also in the comment section who can't even do any basic discounted cash flow analysis or net present value calculations. There are literally supposedly great investors and supposedly great business people there on Seeking Alpha. Most likely it's paid shorts in the comment section who are shorting the stock and aren't disclosing it publicly and have fake names. And they can't even do any discounted cash flow analysis or net present value, because if you run those numbers, Sandstorm Gold looks very, very cheap, with more diversified discounted cash flows coming every single year, probably for years to come. So that's it for right now. This is just a short little show and a short little update, and we'll see what other content is coming in the next couple days. I'll take a look at current events, and I'll see what other interview guests I can get booked. I am still working on Kyle Bass, trying to get him on for an interview. It is very, very tough. He is a billionaire, and I'm not sure. Someone mentioned that he might have signed a non-disclosure agreement, so I'm not sure how much he can actually talk about with the China trade deal information. because he is one of Trump's trade advisors now. Okay, everyone, bye for now. Have a great week.